Hello, everyone, and welcome to April 7th, the Wednesday after Easter. And happy Easter to you and to all those you love. Hope you experienced a very peaceful and meaningful Holy Week and Easter Sunday. And now we find ourselves at the beginning of the Easter season, which will take us all the way until almost the end of May. Today's readings are wonderful, and there is a link that I put in the description for today, and I would encourage you to spend some time with the readings because they are just so beautiful. We spent all of Lent listening to stories about Jesus, the historical Jesus, the human Jesus. And now during this Easter season, we will hear stories about the resurrected Jesus. And just as we hear in the gospel today with the story of the two disciples traveling to Emmaus, Jesus seems to have appeared somewhat in a different form after his resurrection. We hear many stories about how the disciples don't seem to recognize him at first when they encounter him. They realize who he is when they hear his voice, when he calls them by name. Or as in today's reading, when he breaks bread with them. Or in another passage, when he cooks breakfast for them by the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are learning new ways to understand how Jesus' presence will continue to be with them now that he has been resurrected. And all of us, all the followers of Jesus, all these centuries later, we encounter Christ, the one who animates us and gives meaning to our lives. And in doing so, Jesus is made visible. Jesus is understood and experienced in us and through us as we try to embody his mission and message. Some questions that might be good for us to think about and reflect on during the Easter season might be, how do we come to realize that Jesus is in our midst? Just like the disciples struggled to recognize Jesus, how do we recognize Jesus today? And also, how do others come to recognize Jesus through us? So if someone encounters us, would they have any idea about who Jesus is, what his message and mission are? So a story. When I became a Catholic sister, in the first 3 years of that, I lived with a sister called Sister Adrienne Barrett. She was a Scranton native, and Adrienne was all of like 4'10", pretty round, like a little leprechaun. And once you met her, you never forgot her. She was very memorable. Like many sisters in the 60s and 70s, Adrienne taught in school, but then realized that she didn't really like it too much and she wasn't that good at it, and she had a heart for something else. She had a heart for the poor, and she wanted to go back to her hometown of Scranton and work directly with the poor. And so she did. She started with some small food programs and clothing drives, and after years and decades, built a huge organization that has come to be known as Friends of the Poor. Everyone who lived in the Scranton area knew her. If you had furniture to donate, call Sister Adrienne. If you had food that you wanted to give away, call Sister Adrienne. If you wanted to volunteer, call her, and you could be a part of the crew that would put on a Thanksgiving dinner for over 2,000 people every Thanksgiving. She was an institution in the Scranton area. And even if you had no religious affiliation whatsoever, you still knew who Sister Adrienne was. Of course, as is always the case, for as much as people loved her, there were those who really tried to trash her in the news and blame her for any of the problems in the city, blaming it on the poor, and they would blame her too. And what was amazing about her is that she was just as at ease with the politicians and the wealthy donors for her program as she was with the mentally ill, or the homeless, or those who had been in prison, those who had no one to turn to. And what was really neat is the people she helped, as they got on their feet, she would ask them to then be a part of her team and in turn help other people too. Adrienne didn't drive, so she would have different folks drive her from place to place, and one such guy was Cal. I knew Cal very well, and I knew that he had had a tough life and had spent some time in prison. And one time I asked Adrienne, "Do you know why Cal was in prison?" And she said, "Cal had a difficulty with drugs, and one time in a fight, he killed someone." I was a little startled by it, and I asked her if that bothered her at all. And just in Adrienne fashion, she was like, "Cal made a mistake and has become a different person now. And why shouldn't he deserve a second chance?" One of her most amazing ministries was her funeral ministry. If she heard of someone who was homeless on the streets, someone who was very poor who died and didn't have anybody else, she made sure that that person had a proper funeral, had a mass, had a proper burial. And all of us who worked with her, we would all get in our cars and we would go to these funerals. And sometimes we were the only ones there. And without Adrienne caring about them, no one would have been there to remember the life of that person. For Adrienne, everyone mattered. And when she died, thousands upon thousands of people went to her viewing. And her organization continues to this day and does amazing things for those who are most in need. So why do I tell you the story about Adrienne? Do you remember the question I posed earlier about how do we come to recognize Jesus in our everyday life? Just as the disciples had to learn how to recognize Jesus after his resurrection, how do we do that today? And I share about Adrienne because I think she spent her life searching for and learning to recognize Jesus in the most unexpected places and in the people that most would want to ignore or avoid. Like the disciples in the gospel who failed to recognize Jesus at first, we can often do that. But Adrienne seemed to take the time to try to discover Jesus in people you would never expect. And the other question, how do others come to understand Jesus through us? I remember this one time I was with Adrienne at this gathering. And I looked around, and there were people there who had been in prison, who had been homeless, who had been addicted to drugs, who were struggling with mental illness, the elderly, the sick, the poor. And I looked at that gathering with Adrienne as the one who brought everybody together, and I thought, it's kind of what we read about with Jesus and those he gathered around him as well. That I remember in that moment thinking, was this what it was like when Jesus was alive? So how about us in these days that follow our Easter celebration? We hear the story of Jesus, and it continues all of these centuries after that first resurrection. And how is Jesus continuing to live on in you, in me? The gospel today has a wonderful line that says, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way?" Were not our hearts burning within us? Maybe during these Easter days, we can really stay awake and pay attention to those moments when we can feel our hearts burning within us, ready to recognize Jesus in our midst, and perhaps in the places and in the people we least expect. Happy Easter, everybody.